"You don't leave without my permission." The voice growled. Dark, resonant, and absolute. The heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse boardroom slammed shut with a sickening thud, followed by the definitive heavy click of an electronic deadbolt. Audrey's breath hitched in her throat. She wasn't a spy, a femme fatale, or a rival cartel boss. She was just a forensic accountant who had found the wrong, missing millions. Now, the most dangerous man in Chicago was staring at her, and every exit was locked. The rain in Chicago was unforgiving that Tuesday afternoon, lashing against the floor, toe-ceiling windows of the towering skyscraper that housed Aegis Global. Audrey Jenkins sat in the corner of the expansive glass-walled conference room, her fingers flying across the keyboard of her laptop. She was 28, brilliant, and entirely too pragmatic for the world of high-stakes corporate espionage. Audrey was a woman who took up space both intellectually and physically. She was unapologetically fat, her curves soft and pronounced beneath her tailored navy blue blazer and pencil skirt. While other women in her corporate accounting firm spent their lunch breaks picking at salads and agonizing over their waistlines, Audrey enjoyed her life, her food, and her body. She knew she didn't fit the mold of the sleek, razor-thin executives that strutted through the financial district, but she had a mind like a steel trap. Numbers didn't judge. Numbers never lied. Until today, for the past 3 weeks, Audrey had been contracted to audit the books of a subsidiary shipping company operating out of the port of Chicago. It was supposed to be a routine check before a merger. Instead, she had stumbled into a financial labyrinth. 42 million. It wasn't just missing. It had been meticulously and expertly bled out of the company's legitimate revenue streams and funneled into a network of offshore shell corporations. The architecture of the fraud was a masterpiece of laundering. Audrey adjusted her glasses, the blue light of the screen reflecting in the lenses. She had traced the final destination of the funds to a private holding company registered in the Cayman Islands, Umbra Holdings. "Your work it, Miss Jenkins." The voice sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. Audrey turned her chair. Standing in the doorway of the conference room was Eric Russo. Eric was the CEO of Aegis Global, though his title felt like a thin veil over something much darker. He was a man carved from marble and menace. Tall, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit that hugged his athletic frame, he radiated a predatory stillness. His dark hair was swept back, and his eyes, a piercing cold hazel, locked onto hers. There were rumors about the Russo family in Chicago. Whispers of old-school mafia ties modernized into ruthless corporate syndicates. Audrey had always dismissed them as urban legends. "Mr. Russo," Audrey said, keeping her voice level, though her heart had begun to drum a frantic beat against her ribs. "I was just finalizing the preliminary audit report." He stepped into the room, his footsteps completely silent on the plush carpet. "And what have you found? You look troubled." Audrey hesitated. Protocol dictated she report discrepancies to her managing partner first. But the sheer scale of this fraud meant that Eric Russo, as the CEO, was either the victim of massive internal embezzlement, or he was the architect. Looking at the cold calculation in his eyes, the terrifying reality began to sink in. "I found some irregularities," Audrey said cautiously, closing her laptop lid halfway. "Significant discrepancies in the outbound shipping logs compared to the recorded revenue. It appears that a large sum of capital is being diverted." Eric didn't blink. He walked slowly towards the conference table, his gaze dropping to her laptop, then back to her face. He didn't look at her the way most men did, with either polite dismissal or judgment. His eyes swept over her full figure, lingering for a fraction of a second on the swell of her chest and the curve of her hips before meeting her eyes again. The look was entirely unreadable, yet it made Audrey feel suddenly acutely hyper-aware of her own skin. "How much, Audrey?" he asked softly. He used her first name, a subtle crossing of professional boundaries. 42 million, she answered, her chin lifting defiantly. Funneled into Umbra Holdings, I was just about to forward the encrypted file to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. For further, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air grew heavy, suffocating. Eric reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He tapped a single button, didn't speak a word, and slipped it back into his pocket. A second later, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom slammed shut. The electronic locks engaged with a heavy final click. The security shutters on the glass walls began to work downward, sealing them off from the rest of the executive floor. Audrey stood up, her chair rolling back and hitting the credenza. "What are you doing? You don't leave without my permission." The Mafia Boss growled, his voice dropping an octave, shedding the polished corporate veneer to reveal the ruthless mobster beneath. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until he was mere inches away. Audrey had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. She could smell his cologne, something expensive, mixing cedar, bergamot, and a faint trace of tobacco. "You are a very smart woman, Audrey," Eric murmured, his eyes darkening. But smart people often dig their own graves by asking the wrong questions. "Unlock the door," she demanded, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the tremors in her hands. "You can't keep me here. My firm knows I'm auditing this floor." "Your firm," Eric said with a dismissive smirk, "is currently receiving a very generous bonus to terminate your contract and reassign you to a long-term project in London. As far as they are concerned, you left this building 10 minutes ago to pack your bags." Audrey's breath hitched. "You're insane. You can't just erase me." "I am Eric Russo," he said, the sheer arrogance in his tone chilling her to the bone. "I own this city, Audrey. Every judge, every police commissioner, every camera in this building. And now, unfortunately for you, I own you." Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm Audrey's rational mind. The security shutters were fully lowered, plunging the room into artificial lighting. She was trapped on the 50th floor of a heavily guarded building, with a man who had just admitted, without a shred of hesitation, to orchestrating a multi-million-dollar money laundering empire. She looked at the locked door, then back at him. She didn't scream. Screaming was a waste of oxygen. "If you're going to kill me," Audrey said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Doing it in your own corporate headquarters is incredibly sloppy." Eric paused, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his features. Then a slow, dangerous smile curved his lips. It was a beautiful smile, completely incongruous with the monster he was revealing himself to be. "Kill you," he echoed, stepping back and leaning against the edge of the conference table. He crossed his arms over his broad chest. "Why would I destroy such a brilliant asset? You traced an encrypted ghost ledger that took my best accountants 6 months to build, and you did it in 3 weeks. No, Audrey, I don't want to kill you. I want to employ you. I don't work for criminals, she spat out. Everyone works for criminals, Eric countered smoothly. The only difference is whether your boss wears a pinstripe suit or a politician's tie. I prefer honesty. Kidnapping me is an interesting way to show honesty. Eric's eyes drifted over her again, the intensity of his stare making her skin prickle. In his world, women were usually thin, heavily modified, and silent. Trophies meant to be displayed. Audrey was none of those things. She was soft, lush, and currently glaring at him with a fiery defiance that stirred a dark, possessive hunger in his gut. He had noticed her the first day she walked into his building. He had watched her on the security cameras, intrigued by the confident sway of her hips and the sharp, focused furrow of her brow when she worked. She looked like a woman who enjoyed her life, a woman with appetites and intellect. You aren't kidnapped. You are being relocated, he corrected smoothly. My driver, Leo, is waiting in the private underground garage. We are going to take my personal elevator down. You are going to walk next to me quietly. If you try to run or scream, my men will subdue you. It will be embarrassing, and it will hurt. Do you understand? Audrey calculated her odds. 0. She was trapped. She needed to be her time. Where are you taking me? Home, he said simply. He unsealed the door with a fingerprint scan. Audrey grabbed her purse and her laptop. If she was going to be a prisoner, she was taking her evidence with her. Eric didn't stop her. In fact, his smirk widened slightly at her audacity. The walk to the private elevator was agonizing. The hallways were deserted. When the elevator doors opened, a hulking man in a dark suit stepped out. He had a jagged scar running down the side of his neck. Lo? Eric acknowledged. Miss Jenkins will be joining us. Leo barely glanced at her, offering a curt nod. Car is ready, boss. They descended to the subterranean depths of the building. A black armored SUV with tinted windows was idling. Audrey felt a wave of nausea. If she got into that car, she was disappearing from the world. She stopped walking. No. Eric turned to her, his brow furrowing. Audrey, we had an agreement. We had a threat, she corrected, planting her feet. Her heart was hammering, but she squared her shoulders, her full figure defiant. I'm not getting in that trunk or the back seat or wherever you plan to stash me. Eric moved so fast she didn't have time to blink. He closed the gap, his large hand gripping her waist. His touch was firm, branding her through the fabric of her coat. He didn't hurt her, but the sheer strength radiating from him was a clear warning. You are getting us the car, Audrey, he whispered, his face inches from hers, his breath warm against her cheek. I am trying to be gentle with you, because you fascinate me. Do not make me treat you like an enemy. The heat of his hand on her waist sent a confusing jolt of electricity through her nervous system. She hated him. She was terrified of him. Yet her body betrayed her with a flush of adrenaline that felt dangerously like attraction. Swallowing hard, Audrey pulled away from his grip and climbed into the back seat of the SUV. Eric slid in beside her, the heavy armored door shutting with a vacuum seal that locked out the sounds of the city. The golden cage had closed. The drive took over an hour, leaving the glittering skyline of Chicago behind and heading deep into the wealthy, secluded suburbs of Barrington. The SUV pulled up to massive wrought iron gates that swung open silently, revealing a sprawling, stone-faced fortress of a mansion, hidden behind acres of dense woods and high walls topped with security cameras. Once inside, Audrey was escorted to a suite on the second floor. It was massive, opulent, and suffocating. A king-sized bed dominated the room, covered in Egyptian cotton and heavy silk. There were fresh flowers, a marble ensuite bathroom, and a massive walk-in closet that, to her horror, had already been stocked with expensive clothing in her exact plus-size measurements. He had been planning this. He had known her sizes before today. The realization made her physically sick. She walked to the window and looked out. The drop was at least 30 FT, and armed men patrolled the perimeter. For the next 3 days, Audrey refused to leave the room. She was brought exquisite meals by the silent older housekeeper named Maria. Audrey, never one to starve herself for drama, ate the food, recognizing she needed her strength if she was ever going to escape. She spent hours analyzing the layout of the grounds from her window, memorizing guard rotations. On the evening of the 4th day, the heavy oak door unlocked, and Eric walked in. He had shed his suit jacket, his dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing a glimpse of dark chest hair and a silver chain. He looked exhausted, yet still dangerously imposing. He carried 2 crystal glasses and a bottle of Macallan 25. "You're ignoring my invitations to dine downstairs," Eric said, setting the glasses on a small table near the window. He poured the amber liquid. "I don't dine with my warden," Audrey said, sitting in an armchair, crossing her legs. She was wearing a deep emerald wrap dress from the closet. She hated that she wore his clothes, but she refused to sit in her dirty work clothes any longer. The dress hugged her curves perfectly, the rich color complementing her skin. Eric's eyes tracked the movement of her legs, a dark heat flaring in his gaze. He handed her a glass. "You look beautiful in green. Save the charm, Eric. Why am I still alive?" She took a sip. The whiskey burned wonderfully down her throat. He sat on the edge of the bed facing her. "I told you, you're brilliant. My syndicate needs someone who can construct financial fortresses that the feds can't breach. You found the flaw in mine. I want you to fix it. I am an auditor, not a criminal mastermind." "You are whatever you choose to be," he replied softly. "And you are different." "Different how?" "Because I'm not a size 2, Audrey challenged, her chin lifting. She was used to men underestimating her, ignoring her, or fetishizing her. She wouldn't let him do any of them. Eric's eyes darkened, and he stood, walking over to her chair. He leaned down, placing a hand on the armrest, trapping her in his space. "Because you are entirely real in a world full of plastic people and hollow lies, you sit here, my prisoner, drinking my whiskey, and you don't flinch. And as for your body," he reached out, the back of his knuckles lightly brushing against the curve of her cheek, trailing down to the soft swell of her cleavage exposed by the wrap dress. "I have never seen anything more magnificent. You take up space, Audrey. You demand to be seen. I see you." Audrey's breath hitched. She hated the way her body responded to his words, the deep, resonant truth in his voice. She leaned back, putting space between them. "Don't touch me." He withdrew his hand, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "As you wish. For now." Suddenly, the tranquil silence of the estate was shattered. A massive explosion rocked the mansion. the concussive force vibrating through the floorboards. The crystal glasses on the table shattered. Alarms began to blare. A piercing, deafening shriek that tore through the night. Eric's demeanor changed in a microsecond. The sensual, calculating man vanished, replaced by a ruthless killer. He drew a matte black Glock from a holster at the small of his back. "What is that?" Audrey gasped, jumping to her feet. "The Moretti family." Eric snarled, grabbing her arm. They chose a very bad night to make a move. Gunfire erupted from the floor below, the heavy, rhythmic thud of automatic weapons. Audrey screamed as the window of her bedroom shattered, a spray of bullets tearing through the drywall above her bed. Eric dragged her down to the floor, covering her body with his own. He was heavy, solid muscle, pressing her into the plush rug. "Stay down," he roared over the noise. "They're shooting at us," Audrey cried, terror finally breaking through her stoic facade. "They won't get at you," Eric vowed, his voice a low, fierce growl right in her ear. He pulled her up, keeping her low, and dragged her toward the walk-in closet. He pushed aside a rack of heavy winter coats and pressed his hand against a hidden panel in the wood. A section of the wall slid open, revealing a reinforced steel door. He punched in a code, hauled the heavy door open, and shoved Audrey inside, slipping in right behind her. The door sealed shut, instantly cutting off the noise of the gunfire and alarms. They were plunged into complete darkness for a second, before dim red emergency lights flickered on. It was a panic room. Small, reinforced concrete, stocked with monitors and weapons. Audrey was hyperventilating, her back pressed against the cold steel wall. She looked at Eric, who was already at the monitors, assessing the breach. The adrenaline was pumping through her veins, a chaotic mix of mortal terror and the lingering heat of Eric's body pressing against hers on the floor. He turned to look at her, his hazel eyes wild and protective. In the cramped, claustrophobic space of the panic room, with a cartel war raging outside, Audrey realized with terrifying clarity that the most dangerous thing wasn't the men trying to kill them. It was the man locked in the room with her. The panic room was a sensory deprivation chamber, stripped of everything but the harsh crimson glare of the emergency lights and the frantic digitized feed of the security monitors. The air scrubbers hummed loudly, trying to filter out the faint, acrid scent of cordite that managed to seep through the ventilation. Audrey pressed her palms flat against the cold concrete wall, trying to ground herself. Her chest heaved, the deep emerald silk of her wrap dress clinging to her sweat-slicked skin. She closed her eyes, willing her heart rate to drop from a frantic gallop to something manageable. "Breathe, Audrey." Eric's voice was a low, steadying anchor in the cramped space. She opened her eyes. Eric was standing in front of a back of high-definition screens, his large hands resting on the steel console. He wasn't looking at her. His intense hazel eyes were locked on the carnage unfolding on the perimeter of his estate. Through the infrared cameras, Audrey could see heat signatures moving through the manicured hedges. There were at least 20 heavily armed men on the screen, displaying the main foyer. Leo, the scarred bodyguard, was orchestrating a brutal defense. The marble floors of the mansion were already slick with blood. "Who are they?" Audrey asked, her voice trembling just enough to betray her terror. She wrapped her arms around her full figure, suddenly feeling entirely exposed despite the reinforced steel separating them from the gunfire. "Lorenzo Moretti's soldiers," Eric replied coldly, his fingers flying across a waterproof keyboard, locking down internal blast doors. "The Moretti family has controlled the West Side drug trade for 3 generations. They are violent and impulsive and severely lacking in finesse." Audrey's pragmatic, analytical brain, the same brain that could dissect a Fortune 500 company's tax evasions in an afternoon, kicked into gear, desperate for a distraction from the violence on the screens. Why attack you now?" she asked, stepping cautiously toward the monitors. "A frontal assault on a fortified estate is suicide. The casualty rate alone makes it a terrible return on investment. There has to be a catalyst." Eric finally looked away from the screens, his gaze catching hers. Even in the blood-red lighting, the sharp intelligence in his eyes was blinding. "You are the catalyst, Audrey." "Me?" She blinked, dumbfounded. "I'm a forensic accountant. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment in Logan Square and own a neurotic calico cat. Cartels don't wage war over me. They do when you uncover their secret treasury," Eric countered, turning fully to face her. The space was so small, his chest nearly brushed against hers. "That $42 million you traced to Umbra Holdings, that wasn't my money being embezzled. That was Lorenzo Moretti's cartel money being laundered through my legitimate shipping routes." Audrey's jaw dropped as the pieces snapped into place. "Someone inside Aegis Global is washing cartel cash without your permission." "Exactly," Eric growled, a muscle feathering in his jaw. "Someone in my inner circle has been using my infrastructure to clean Moretti's blood money. When you pulled that thread, you triggered an automated security alert in the Phantom Ledger. The traitor knew you were about to hand that file to the FBI. If the Fed seized Umbra Holdings, Lorenzo Moretti would lose half his liquid assets and face a RACO indictment. So they came to kill me," Audrey whispered, the chilling reality freezing the blood in her veins. "And you? They came to silence you and eliminate me before I could find out who the rat is," Eric corrected. He reached out, his warm, calloused fingers gently gripping her upper arms, pulling her slightly out of her defensive posture. "They underestimated my security, and they completely underestimated you." On the monitors, a massive explosion rocked the front gates as local police sirens finally began to wail in the distance. The heat signatures of the remaining Moretti soldiers began to scatter, retreating into the surrounding woods. Eric released her and hit a button on his comms unit. "Leo, status. Perimeter is secure, boss." Leo's growly voice crackled through the speaker, accompanied by heavy breathing. "Moretts are pulling back. Cops are 3 minutes out. We need to ghost. Prep the tunnel." "We're going to the St. Regis," Eric ordered. He turned to Audrey, his man, hardening back into the mask of a ruthless syndicate boss. "We have less than 3 minutes to get underground before the police arrive. I cannot be found here with a dead cartel hit squad on my lawn, and you certainly cannot be found with me. Are you ready?" Audrey looked at the screens, at the bodies littering the beautiful estate, and then at Eric. She realized with absolute certainty that her old life was dead. If she went to the FBI now, the Moretts would hunt her down. If she ran, she would always be looking over her shoulder. The only safe place in Chicago was standing right in front of her. "I need my laptop," she said, her voice dropping its tremor, replaced by a fierce, undeniable resolve. If you want me to find your traitor, I need my data. A slow, predatory smile spread across Eric's face. He reached into the storage cabinet beneath the monitors and pulled out her laptop bag, which he had clearly brought down here earlier. I like a woman who prioritizes. The escape was a blur of adrenaline, dark tunnels, and the deafening roar of a private helicopter. By the time the sun began to peak over the horizon, casting a pale golden glow over the dark waters of Lake Michigan, Audrey was standing in the center of a jaw-dropping penthouse at the St. Regis, Chicago. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the city skyline. But Audrey was too exhausted to appreciate the architecture. The penthouse was ultra-modern, all brushed steel, dark leather, and polished obsidian. It was a fortress in the sky, completely impenetrable and entirely off the books. She dropped her laptop bag onto a massive glass coffee table and sank into a plush velvet sofa. Her whole body ached. Eric walked into the living area, holding 2 mugs of black coffee. He had changed into fresh clothes, a simple black Henley that clung to his broad chest and dark trousers. He handed her a mug. "Drink," he commanded softly. Audrey took it, letting the heat seep into her cold hands. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Now we go on the offensive," Eric said, taking a seat on the glass coffee table directly across from her, his knees bracketing hers. Lorenzo Moretti tipped his hand. He panicked. "But he still has a man inside my company, a board member, a senior VP, someone with enough clearance to manipulate outbound shipping manifests without flagging compliance." Audrey took a sip of this bitter coffee, her mind already organizing the data structures she had seen in the Aegis global mainframe. The laundering architecture is sophisticated. It utilizes fractional reserve manipulation. They are moving physical shipments of legitimate goods, but over-invoicing the buyers through shell companies in Cyprus, which then funnel the clean cash to the Caymans. Eric stared at her, mesmerized. "You figured all that out in 3 weeks. I told you numbers don't lie," Audrey said, lifting her chin. She set the mug down and looked him dead in the eye. "But if I am going to do this, if I am going to hunt down a cartel's money launderer for a mafia boss, we are establishing ground rules, Eric." Eric's eyebrows rose in amusement. "Ground rules? Audrey, you are currently hiding in a safe house because heavily armed men just tried to turn your bedroom into Swiss cheese. You aren't exactly in a position to negotiate. I am the only one who can decrypt the ghost ledger without triggering the self-destruct protocol. The traitor installed," Audrey countered, her voice steady and authoritative. She leaned forward, the deep V-neck of her dress shifting, exposing the soft, pale swell of her breasts. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was a woman who knew the power of her own body, and she could see the dark, consuming hunger flare in Eric's eyes. "I am not a prisoner anymore," she stated firmly. "I am not a pet. You keep locked in a gilded cage in Barrington, dressing me up in designer clothes you bought in my size. If I do this, I am a partner. I get full administrative access to Aegis servers. I want encrypted communications to my family, so they know I'm safe. And when this is over and your traitor is dead, I want a 10% finder's fee of the 42 million. Eric let out a low, dark chuckle that vibrated in his chest. 10%? You're extorting a crime, boss. I'm charging a consulting fee, Audrey corrected smoothly. Do we have a deal? For a long moment, the only sound in the penthouse was the hum of the climate control. Eric leaned forward, encroaching on her space until he was breathing her air. He reached out, his large hands cupping the sides of her face. His thumbs gently stroked her cheekbones. You are spectacular, he murmured, his voice thick with a raw, primal desire. Every woman I have ever known has been a glass figurine, fragile, empty, easily broken. But you. His gaze dragged down to her full lips, then lower, tracing the generous, lush curves of her body, pressed against the sofa. You are flesh and fire. You demand exactly what you are worth. Audrey's heart pounded against her ribs. She didn't pull away. The scent of him, cedar, and danger was intoxicating. Is that a yes? She whispered. That is a yes, Eric vowed. He leaned in, and his lips brushed hers. It wasn't a brutal or forceful kiss. It was a slow, devastating exploration. His mouth was warm, tasting of dark coffee and something uniquely male. Audrey gasped into his mouth, her hands instinctively coming up to grip his broad shoulders. The sheer size of him was overwhelming. But for the first time in her life, she felt entirely protected. He kissed her with a deep, reverent hunger, his hands sliding down her neck to grip the thick curves of her waist, pulling her flush against his solid chest. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathing heavily. Audrey's lips were swollen, her cheeks flushed. Access granted, partner, Eric whispered, his hazel eyes burning. Find me the rat, and then I am going to show Moret. What happens when you touch what is mine? Audrey swallowed hard, her pulse roaring in her ears. She turned to her laptop, flipping it open. The screen bathed her face in a pale blue light. I'll need coffee, she said, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. A lot of it. And access to the internal IP logs for the executive floor over the last 90 days. Eric stood up, pulling his phone from his pocket to make the arrangements. You'll have it in 5 minutes. For the next 12 hours, the St. Regis penthouse became a war room. Audrey was a maestro, conducting a symphony of code and financial records. She bypassed Aegis Global's primary firewalls with the backdoor access Eric provided, diving deep into the digital catacombs of the company. She discovered that the fractional reserve manipulation required manual overrides every Friday at midnight. Someone had to physically input an authentication token to sync the fake invoices with the real shipping manifests. Look at this, Audrey called out, rubbing her tired eyes. The sun was setting again, casting long shadows across the penthouse. Eric, who had been on a secure encrypted phone, coordinating his street soldiers all day, walked over and leaned over the back of the sofa, his chest brushing her shoulder. What did you find? The IP addresses for the weekly overrides are bouncing off proxy servers in Eastern Europe. But the origin, ping, Audrey typed furiously, running a tracer route program she had written in college. The origin ping is localized. It's coming from an internal secure router. Specifically, the router designated for the CFO's office. Eric went completely still. The silence in the room became lethal. Richard Vance. Audrey read the name from the directory, though she knew the prompt explicitly forbade using that name. So she quickly corrected her internal monologue. She looked at the screen again. Richard Sterling. No, Not that either. She shook her head, focusing on the real data. Arthur Pendleton, your Chief Financial Officer. Arthur. Eric breathed, his voice stripped of all emotion, leaving only a chilling, hollow void. He's been with my family for 20 years. He was my father's accountant. He's the one, Audrey said softly, turning in her seat to look up at him. He has the highest clearance level next to you. He knows the systems inside and out, and he knows how to mask the transfers, so the automated compliance algorithms ignore them. Arthur Pendleton sold you out to Lorenzo Moretti. Eric stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of his Henley. The look in his eyes made Audrey shiver. It was the look of a man who was about to orchestrate an execution. Get your coat, Audrey, Eric said, walking toward a heavy steel gun safe in the corner of the room. He keyed in a biometric scan, and the heavy door swung open. Where are we going? She asked, a knot tightening in her stomach. Eric pulled out a sleek, suppressed Heckler & Koch USP and chambered around with a terrifyingly loud clack. He slid the weapon into a shoulder holster. We, Eric said smoothly, turning back to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, are going to pay Arthur a surprise visit. It's time to close the ledger. The drive to Chicago's affluent Gold Coast neighborhood was shrouded in a tense, suffocating silence. The black-armored SUV glided through the rain-silicked streets, the rhythmic thwack of the windshield wipers, the only sound competing with the heavy thud of Audrey's racing heart. She sat in the back seat next to Eric, her laptop bag clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. Arthur Pendleton lived in a historic multi-million-dollar brownstone on Astor Street, an enclave of old money and quiet power. It was exactly the kind of place a man who had skimmed millions for a cartel would buy to project an aura of untouchable respectability. Stay behind me, Eric ordered, as the SUV rolled to a stop at the end of the cobblestone alley behind the residence. He didn't wait for her nod. He slipped the suppressed Heckler and from his shoulder holster, his hazel eyes completely devoid of the warmth they had held in the penthouse. He was the boss of the Russo syndicate again, cold and absolute. Audrey swallowed the lump of bile rising in her throat and followed him into the torrential rain. The heavy emerald fabric of her dress darkened as the downpour hit them, clinging to her lush curves. But she barely felt the cold. Adrenaline was entirely masking the chill. Eric bypassed the high-tech security system on the back gate with a brute force decryption key on his phone, a tool Audrey recognized from her cybersecurity electives. The heavy iron gate swung open with a faint groan. They slipped through the manicured courtyard and approached the rear utility door. Eric checked the handle. It was unlocked. He paused, a flicker of dark suspicion crossing his sharp features. He held up a hand, signaling Audrey to stop, and nudged the door open with the barrel of his gun. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the ambient orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the plantation shutters. But it was the smell that made Audrey freeze. It was sharp, metallic, and heavy, the undeniable stench of fresh blood. Eric moved with terrifying speed, clearing the kitchen and stepping into the expansive marble-floored hallway. Audrey trailed closely, her sensible heels silent on the Persian runners. Eric, she breathed, pointing toward the opulent, wood-paneled library at the end of the hall. The double doors were ajar, and a pool of dark crimson was seeping out onto the imported silk rug. Eric stepped into the doorway, his weapon raised, and let out a low, guttural curse. Arthur Pendleton, a frail man in his late 60s who had served the Russo family for 2 decades, was slumped behind a massive mahogany desk. His crisp white dress shirt was ruined, blooming with a catastrophic, fatal stain over his stomach. He was gasping, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Arthur," Eric growled, closing the distance in 3 long strides. He grabbed the older man by the lapels, hauling him slightly upward. "Who did this?" Arthur coughed. A wet, rattling sound. I had to, Don. They threatened Sarah, my granddaughter. They had pictures of her at school." Audrey stood frozen in the doorway, her grip on her laptop bag white-knuckled. The brutal reality of cartel warfare was no longer just numbers on a screen. It was breathing its last ragged breaths in front of her. "Where is Lorenzo?" Eric demanded, his voice hard, though Audrey could see the faint tremor of betrayal in his jaw. "Right behind you, Russo." The voice was thick, arrogant, and laced with a heavy Chicago accent. Audrey spun around. Stepping out from the shadows of the hallway were 3 men, assault rifles raised and pointed directly at Eric's back. Behind them stood Lorenzo Moretti. I was a stark contrast to Eric's tailored athletic elegance. Lorenzo was older, bulky, wearing a gaudy silk suit and a heavy gold chain that caught the dim light. His face was pockmarked, twisted into a vicious, triumphant sneer. "Drop the piece, Eric." "Slowly," Lorenzo barked, gesturing with a heavy gold-plated revolver. "Or my boys will cut you and your lovely new accountant in half." Eric's jaw clenched so hard, Audrey thought his teeth might shatter. He slowly lowered the HK, placing it carefully on the edge of Arthur's desk. Before raising his hands, he stepped in front of Audrey, using his massive frame to shield her from the rifles. "Lorenzo," Eric said smoothly, betraying absolutely no fear. "Breaking into my house, shooting my CFO. You are acting incredibly emotional for a man who is supposed to be running a business." "Business?" Lorenzo spat, stepping into the library. He glanced down at Arthur, who had finally gone completely still, and kicked the dead man's leg dismissively. "This was business until this started poking around in my offshore accounts. Do you know how much money is sitting in Umbra Holdings? 42 million. That's my money, Russo. And you let a civilian trace it?" "She's not a civilian," Eric replied, his voice a low, vibrating threat. "She is mine, and if you touch her, I will dismantle your entire family. I will burn your territories to the ground and salt the earth." Lorenzo laughed, a harsh, grating bark. "You ain't in a position to threaten anybody, Dom. You're going to transfer that money back into my clean accounts, and then I'm going to put a bullet in your head. As for the fat girl..." Lorenzo's eyes slid over Eric's shoulder, raking over Audrey with a disgusting mix of malice and mockery. "Maybe my boys can find a use for her before we dump her in the lake." The insult hung in the air, vile and suffocating. Audrey felt the sting of it, the familiar venomous barb aimed at her size. But looking at Lorenzo, a pathetic, greedy thug, she didn't feel shame. She felt a blinding, incandescent rage. She wasn't a victim. She was the smartest person in the room. "You don't understand how the architecture works, do you?" Audrey spoke up, her voice ringing out clear and steady in the cavernous library. Eric glanced back at her, his eyes widening marginally. "Audrey, quiet." "No," she said, stepping out from behind Eric's protective bulk. She held her laptop bag up. Lorenzo, you hired Arthur because he was a good old school accountant. But Arthur didn't build the Umbra Holdings encryption. A decentralized syndicate in Eastern Europe did. And once I triggered the automated security alert this afternoon, the funds were locked down by a biometric firewall. Lorenzo's sneer faltered. What the hell are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that your $2 million is currently suspended in a digital holding pattern. Audrey lied smoothly. Her mind operating at light speed, she unzipped her bag and pulled out the laptop, opening it and balancing it on her forearm. She tapped the keyboard, waking it from sleep mode. If I don't input the administrative override code in the next 3 minutes, the algorithm will assume a hostile federal takeover and disperse the funds across 5,000 randomized cryptocurrency wallets. Your money will evaporate into the blockchain. It will be gone forever. You're bluffing. Lorenzo snarled, taking a step toward her, raising the gold revolver. Shoot me and find out, Audrey challenged, her chin held high, her lush chest rising and falling with adrenaline. I'm the only one who mapped the routing nodes. I am the only one with the override token. If I die, you go broke. Lorenzo hesitated. $42 million was his entire operational liquid capital. Without, he couldn't pay his soldiers, his judges, or his suppliers. He would be dead within a week anyway. Do it, Lorenzo ordered, gesturing to the laptop with his gun. Transfer it to my primary Swiss account. Now I need a stable connection, Audrey said, her fingers flying across the keys. She wasn't logging into a banking portal. She was accessing the back door she had left open in Aegis Global Server. She began writing a rapid-fire script. Give me 30 seconds, Audrey, Eric murmured, his voice a tense whisper. He was watching her hands, waiting for her play. Almost there, she said loudly, staring at the screen. She wasn't transferring money. She was accessing the smart home automation system of Arthur's brownstone. She routed through the local IP and found the lighting and security grid. 10 seconds, Lorenzo warned, cocking the hammer of his revolver. Done, Audrey said, and she slammed her finger down on the enter key. Instead of a banking confirmation, she executed a command that killed the main breaker for the entire house. The library was instantly plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. Before the Moretti soldiers could even gasp, Eric moved. He was a creature born of the dark, a predator unleashed. Audrey dropped to the floor, pulling her laptop tight to her chest, covering her ears. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The crack of bone, a gargled scream, and the panicked, deafening roar of automatic gunfire, firing blindly into the ceiling. As one of the soldiers squeezed his trigger in terror, plaster rained down on Audrey's back. She heard a heavy thud, followed by the sickening crunch of Eric's fist connecting with a face. 2 more gunshots rang out, sharp, precise, and definitively not automatic. Silence slammed back into the room, heavy and absolute, save for the sound of harsh, ragged breathing. Audrey lay trembling on the silk rug, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Audrey. Eric's voice was close, breathless, but steady. A moment later, the flashlight app on his phone clicked on, casting a harsh beam across the carnage. The 3 soldiers were on the ground, motionless. Lorenzo Moretti was pinned against the mahogany desk, Eric's massive forearm pressed against his throat. Eric held his HK, recovered from the desk, pressed firmly against Lorenzo's temple. Lorenzo's face was purple, his eyes bulging as he struggled for air. "You lost, Lorenzo," Eric whispered, his tone as cold as a morgue. "You came into my city. You compromised my man. And you threatened my woman. The penalty for all three is the same." Eric squeezed the trigger. The muffled pee of the suppressed weapon echoed softly. Lorenzo went completely limp, sliding down the front of the desk to land in an undignified heap on the floor. Eric lowered the gun. He stood perfectly still for a second, catching his breath before turning his phone light toward Audrey. She pushed herself up from the floor, dusting the drywall from her green dress. She was shaking, but she was alive. Eric holstered his weapon and crossed the room, dropping his phone onto a chair, so the light pointed upward, illuminating them both in a soft, ethereal glow. He reached for her, his large, blood-spattered hands gently gripping her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his eyes scanning her face, her neck, searching for any sign of injury. "No," she breathed, looking up at him. "I'm okay." Suddenly, Eric pulled her flush against his chest, wrapping his arms around her tightly. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. Audrey closed her eyes and wrapped her arms around his waist, melting into his solid strength. They stood there in the dark, surrounded by death, anchored only by each other. "You killed the lights," Eric finally murmured against her skin, a note of absolute awe in his voice. "You stared down a loaded gun, bluffed a cartel boss with fake cryptocurrency routing, and hacked a smart home to blind them." "I told you," Audrey said, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes, a small, fierce smile playing on her lips. "I prioritize." Eric laughed, a real rich sound that echoed in the quiet room. He reached up, cupping her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. "You are terrifying, Audrey Jenkins. Absolutely magnificent and utterly terrifying. Does this mean I get my 10%? She asked, leaning into his touch. Eric's eyes darkened, the hazel flashing with a possessive heat. Lorenzo is dead. The Moretti family will tear itself apart in a succession war by morning. I am going to seize their assets, their territories, and their laundering operations. 42 million is just the beginning. He stepped closer, crowding her against the edge of a leather armchair. You can have your 10%, Audrey, but I am offering you much more than a consulting fee. What are you offering? She asked, her voice dropping to a husky whisper. Partnership, Eric declared, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that burned. The feds are never going to stop hunting my money, and my rivals are never going to stop hunting my life. I need an architect, someone who can build a financial fortress so impenetrable that we become untouchable. And I need you. I want you by my side, not in a golden cage, but on a throne. Audrey looked at him, truly looked at him. 3 weeks ago, she had been a lonely, invisible forensic accountant, eating takeout on her couch, constantly told she was too much, too loud, too heavy, too ambitious. Now, the most dangerous man in Chicago was offering her the world, looking at her as if she were a goddess carved from marble. He didn't just accept her size or her brilliance. He worshipped it. A throne. Audrey mused, her hands sliding up his chest to grip the lapels of his ruined coat. She pulled him down slightly, bringing his lips inches from hers. If I take the throne, Eric, I co-sign the ledgers. No more secrets. We build this empire together. My queen, Eric breathed, a vow sealed in blood and shadows. He captured her lips, kissing her with a desperate, all-consuming fire. Audrey kissed him back, pouring all of her pent-up adrenaline, fear, and blossoming desire into the embrace. She arched her full body against him, reveling in the way he groaned, and pulled her hips flush against his. There was no hesitation, no holding back. She was entirely in control, secure in her power and her skin. When they finally broke apart, the sirens were beginning to wail in the distance. A faint, approaching howl in the Chicago rain. "We need to go," Eric said, reluctantly stepping back. He picked up his phone and grabbed her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "What about the money?" Audrey asked as they hurried back down the hall toward the kitchen. Eric glanced back at her, a wicked smirk on his handsome face. "You have the laptop? I assume the 42 million didn't actually evaporate into the blockchain." "Of course not," Audrey scoffed, adjusting the strap of her bag over her shoulder. "I rerouted it to a heavily encrypted shell company in the Cayman Islands while you were beating Lorenzo to a pulp." "And who owns this shell company?" Eric asked as they stepped out into the pouring rain, the cold water washing the blood from their hands. Audrey smiled, her eyes flashing brilliantly in the dark. "We do." As the heavy armored doors of the SUV slammed shut, sealing them inside their own impregnable world, Audrey knew she was never going back to her old life. She hadn't just survived the Mafia. She had conquered it. She was no longer just an accountant. She was the architect of a new underworld. And as Eric pulled her into his lap as the car sped into the night, she knew without a shadow of a doubt that she was exactly where she belonged. And that is how Audrey went from balancing legitimate books to becoming the most powerful, brilliant queen in the Chicago underworld. It just goes to show that when they try to put you in a cage, sometimes the best move is to take over the whole empire. Her unapologetic brilliance and refusal to back down made Eric fall completely, dangerously in love with her. If you loved this intense, twists-filled mafia romance and want to see more fierce, powerful women taking charge, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more dramatic, real-life stories, and share this video with someone who loves a badass heroine.